It's the mother of all talk shows, all right, and here until 10 o'clock, and indeed for the rest of this week on this slot between 7 and 10. It's the Open University of the airwaves, and it's a two-way street because your calls, especially if they disagree with me, are very welcome indeed. 0344 499 1000.
The mother of all talk shows with George Galloway.
This is a good deal.
On Talk Radio.
It's a red letter day in so many ways. In the last hour, we'll be talking to the legendary former Texan Congressman Ron Paul, a man who stood for the presidency of the United States and through his now widely respected Ron Paul Institute strikes out on foreign policy issues. We'll be talking to him most proximately about Donald Trump, because at midnight tonight, Standard Eastern Time, that's 5 a.m. here in London, the first round of reimposed economic sanctions, a continuation of war by other means and not an alternative to war, as many people seem to forget. Siege, quarantine, economic sanctions are acts of war in international law, unless they have the authorization of international law through the Security Council of the United Nations, which in this case, of course, they don't. In fact, everybody except Israel and Saudi Arabia are against Donald Trump's unilateral scrapping of the Iran nuclear deal and the return to the path to war with the Islamic Republic of Iran. What could possibly go wrong? Donald Trump, the bull in the china shop, at 5 a.m. tomorrow morning, will set the clock ticking to what could end up another Middle Eastern war, because this is merely a precursor to a much more savage raft of sanctions which are due to come into place in November. November is always an auspicious date in US-Iranian relations, and it usually ends with Iran springing an October surprise. And it will be no surprise to me if Iran doesn't do so again, and the imminence of what would be, in effect, a full-scale regime change operation kicking in November. But we'll talk to Senator Congressman Ron Paul about many things. His son is Senator Rand Paul, still a live wire in American congressional politics. We'll be talking to Ron Paul also about Russiagate, and the ongoing pursuit of President Trump by the Democrats and the deep state and most of the US media on the Russia front. Senator John McCain openly stated just a few days ago that Ron Paul was an agent of President Vladimir Putin. So, should I call him Comrade Ron Paul or Senator, Congressman? We'll see. We'll take some guidance on that. But in the first hour, we'll be talking about a matter much closer to home, on which we touched last night, but no sooner had I left the studio last night and I saw a scoop on the front page of the Daily Express. Not words in recent years it's been possible to utter. But under new ownership, perhaps the Express is ruffling a few feathers, is rustling up some journalistic fervour, because their scoop was then followed by more or less everybody else. And it was this: the Fair Oak Farm conspiracy. Sounds like an Agatha Christie story, and indeed it may well turn out to be. But here's the story as revealed by the Daily Express. A dirty dozen. We had the Gang of Four in the early 80s. Now we've got the dirty dozen of anti-Corbyn coup plotters inside the Parliamentary Labour Party have been routinely taking the 7:39 p.m. out of Waterloo Station down to Sussex and into a limousine and carted off to a £150 a night luxury farmhouse spread, where, according to one of the participants, who does acknowledge that he was there, someone called Chris Leslie, you'd be forgiven if you've never heard of him, though, as I recall, he has quite a conceit of himself for a man who has achieved virtually nothing in British politics. He admits he was there, but says they were discussing merely policy development, and added disingenuously, of course, I don't recall the name Jeremy Corbyn even cropping up in the discussions. So a dirty dozen of Blairite anti-Corbyn coup plotters spent night after night, week after week at the Fair Oak Farm, and Chris Leslie doesn't recall the name of Jeremy Corbyn even popping up. And if you believe that, I have a bridge here in London that I can sell you. One other alleged participant, though, and it's important to make this clear, vehemently now, not in the story, though he claims the quotes attributed to him in the story are also falsified. He has vehemently denied to us, and we must accept it, that Stephen Kinnock was not one of the plotters, at least at the Fair Oak Farm. He's never been there, he says, and he's taking action against the Daily Express for saying that he was. But we have established that the Express are right, that there have been regular meetings at the Fair Oak Farm, and we have at least one Blairite Labour Member of Parliament admitting that he was there, for policy development, of course. Personally, I regard it as an important step forward in the journalistic endeavours that I hope are now underway to unmask what is an attempt at another coup against Jeremy Corbyn, this time by actually breaking away from the Labour Party, forming their own independent group, and if they can get enough people on board, seeking recognition from the Speaker of the House of Commons to sit as a pro-EU, I suppose you'd have to call them pro-war group of Blairites. I don't know what they'd call themselves, the War Criminals Party. They have all supported the war crimes that Labour and Conservative governments have carried out over the last 15 years or so. Or, I don't know, the Survivalists, or some other name you can come up, perhaps, with some suggestions. And if you're in a journalistic endeavour, to try and get to the bottom of a story, it's always a good rubric to follow the money. So, I called on overnight the Labour leadership not to be a punch bag in this affair, but to go onto the front foot. We know that Chris Leslie was there, so have him in. Grill him on what he was doing there. Which policy development was he involved in? Who paid for the trips to Fair Oak Farm? Not the public, one hopes. And if not the public, then whom? Who has put up £50 million, £50 million, undreamt of treasure in the launch of a British political party, to launch a new centre party? Who put it up? I want to know. Is it foreign money? Is it money that's come from the near abroad, from the EU, from Europhile campaigning organisations, from foreign donors? I want to know that, don't you? Doesn't British democracy demand absolute transparency on who is funding the creation of a breakaway party from Labour, and who knows, maybe a breakaway party from the Brexiteer Conservatives too? And how will it fare? Will it do as well as the SDP? Well, if it does, it will keep Theresa May in power for a decade, which may, of course, be the point, certainly from the point of view of those donating the money. Which Labour MPs are likely to join it? How many Labour MPs are likely to join it? What will their attitude be to East-West relations, to events in the Middle East, to a potential war coming up with Iran? What will their attitude be on domestic and foreign politics? 0344 499 1000 is the number to have your say. We'll be talking to the great Steve Topple, independent journalist at the Canary, in my case for the second time today, because he and I are, of course, a double act in our Topple Galloway show. We'll be talking to Barbara Slavin, director of the Future of Iran initiative at the Atlantic Council. We'll be talking to Matthew Cochrane, spokesperson for the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, following the earthquake in Indonesia. The 6.9 magnitude quake is known to have killed nearly 100 people and left 20,000 people homeless and sent thousands of tourists fleeing, including David Beckham and family, as I just saw in a picture in the newspaper. And then finishing off the show for a whole hour, maybe half of it devoted to him personally, Ron Paul, a figure of historical importance in American politics and in the politics of opposition to foreign adventures. It's all coming up over the next 2 3/4 hours or so with me, George Galloway, on the mother of all talk shows. Now, Steve Topple of the Canary website, which is the second most popular alternative independent news site in the United Kingdom, coming after Breitbart and ahead of all the others, is a good friend of mine. In fact, I only left him a couple of hours ago and he was blazing, I can tell you, because he and I present a show on Patreon called Topple Galloway. I didn't know that he'd been booked for this evening, and I hope he doesn't mind remaking my acquaintance after such a brief period apart. Steve Topple, welcome to the show.
It feels like days, George, already since I last saw you.
We're umbilically tied together. Now, Steve, on this occasion, I want to talk to you about the Labour moderates. I said earlier that Stephen Kinnock has vehemently denied ever having been in the Fair Oak Farm conspiracy, and of course we must take him at his word on that. It would be a very risky thing for him to do, to deny it and then be found to have actually been there. So that makes the Dirty Dozen a kind of sneaky 11, although only one has confirmed that they were there. This was in the Daily Express, under new ownership, it's true, but in recent years with no real track record of breaking actual real stories. Are you at all suspicious about the provenance of this plot?
Look, I mean, as far as stories go, if you like, George, I'm confused as to which author this has come from. It's either sort of an Enid Blyton, The Dirty Dozen Go Wild in Sussex, or it's an Agatha Christie with skullduggery at Fair Oak Farm. I mean, it's straight out of a sort of classic British literary author's handiwork.
Yeah,
isn't it?
absolutely. If the numbers get smaller, 5 go to Fair Oak Farm, an English summer.
It could be perfect, couldn't it? Look, I mean, in terms of the fact that it's broken in the Express, obviously you have to proceed with caution regarding the story, but the fact Chris Leslie has sort of come out and been happily questioned, and also the very fact that these meetings are taking place in the first place, even if they can deny to their blue in the face that Corbyn wasn't even mentioned. I think Chris Leslie said that Jeremy Corbyn's name didn't even come up. I'm sure there are a few expletives that were referenced to the leader of the Labour Party.
He doesn't know that we bugged Fair Oak Farm.
Well, I thought we were saving that, George, for tomorrow. Look, I mean, he can deny till he's blue in the face. You're telling me that some of the most notorious anti-Corbyn MPs have been repeatedly meeting in a clandestine bed and breakfast in Sussex, and they haven't once mentioned Corbyn?
No, as I said, if you believe that, I've got a bridge here in London. I can sell you at a knockdown price.
Exactly. And the thing is, I mean, it's to be expected. I mean, you and I both commented, and I know I wrote, the first article I wrote about Jeremy Corbyn's leadership when he took over in 2016, was that I believe this will end up in the split of the Labour Party. I think it's a case of when, not an if question here. But and you know as well as I do, being a former Labour MP for many years, that these divisions have always been present in the Labour Party. You can go right back to Nye Bevan quitting the cabinet in 1951 over policy divisions with Clement Attlee, and then right through the 80s, the formation of the SDP, through the Blair years. It's just that with Corbyn being elected and this perceived quote-unquote hard left leader, the divisions are all the more to the fore, if you like, because the two sections of the party's stances are so extreme. So I think this has been a long time coming. But,
yes, that's right. What has held this broad church, if you like, together, although I'm always queasy when that's mentioned because I was chucked out of it. That's how broad it was. I had been a Labour Party member for 36 years, from the age of 13, and was a sitting Labour MP and was kicked out of it. So I'm not sure that it's fair to describe it hitherto as a broad church. But what kept the left and the right together was Britain's electoral system, virtually unique in Europe. We have a first-past-the-post electoral system, and if you try and set up something new, I'm actually the founder of the only party that I can think of that did set up in modern times and did win a seat in Parliament, in my case, twice, in two different cities. But it's very hard. And you could get, as the Greens have found, as the UKIP found, you can get millions of votes in the country and no MPs. And so that electoral system has until now acted as a kind of glue which kept widely disparate people together, people that wouldn't and didn't give each other house room, but had no choice but to sit on the same bench. But the question is has that changed now?
No, of course it hasn't changed. And this is the, if you like, one of the more serious aspects of this story. We can laugh and joke about the sort of literary connotations and the fact that it was broken in the Express. But the serious point to be had, well, the two serious points to be had in this story, is firstly that the whole notion of having another party under the first past the post system is absolute political suicide, because all it's going to do, it will keep the Tories in power for a generation, because they're not going to, however much the Green Party, even UKIP, proclaim to want proportional representation, which is the other alternative voting system, the much fairer voting system in my eyes. And while some of the noises off coming from certain camps in Labour are also keen on the idea of PR, as it's called, it's not going to get through anytime soon. We're going to be stuck with a first past the post system, and therefore these plotting, scheming, moderate Blairites, whatever you wish to call the swines, know this full well, and it would be disastrous to have a second party form.
Well, yeah, I mean, you say it would only keep the Tories in power, but as DCI Hunt famously said, you say that as if it's a bad thing. You see, there are lots of people, especially people who are ready to put up £50 million, who want to keep the Tories in power. And there are a lot of Labour MPs, and John Woodcock openly said so after he resigned recently. He's another Fair Oak Farm fellow that's been mentioned. He said, I'd rather see Theresa May in power than Jeremy Corbyn. So it's a kind of win-win for them. Either they hold their seats and successfully float a new party, or they keep Jeremy Corbyn out of power.
Indeed. Sorry, Joe. Yeah, I was mistakenly speaking from the perspective that these plotting moderate MPs actually cared about the electorate. Sorry, my mistake. Of course they don't.
A fundamental error for a political journalist of your sagacity.
Terrible. Indeed, they would of course much prefer Theresa May to be in power than Jeremy Corbyn, and this is their driving force, if you like. And it's so If you sit back and think about it, it's absolutely preposterous that this group of MPs and 20 more within the Labour Party are so viciously and bloodthirsty opposed to having Corbyn in power that they would go so far as to keep millions of people impoverished in this country under a Conservative government. It beggars belief, quite frankly. But there's a second issue here, and briefly, if I can just touch on it, it's the fact that while all this is going on, we're seeing a resurgence in the far right in this country. We had it with the bookshop being targeted at the weekend by a gang of 12 far-right activists, 3 of whom have now been exposed as being UKIP members. You have the whole situation with Tommy Robinson. And while all this is going on, you have the main opposition party in this country thoroughly distracted by this nonsense about the Fair Oak Farm and these MPs maybe possibly talking about forming another party. And while Labour should be focusing on ingratiating themselves into working class communities, because let's not forget that in the 2017 general election, Labour only managed to increase their share of the vote in the lowest socio-economic statuses, that is the poorest people in society, the DE group. They managed to increase their vote share by 7 percentage points. Now, the Tories increased it by 12 percentage points.
So 12% of the poorest people in Britain more voted Tory.
They did, yes. And
Wow.
part of that must be the UKIP effect. But also part of it, you need to question why Labour didn't manage to break through so much into the poorest members of society. And with the rise of the far right and its way of targeting working class poor communities and mopping them up, if you like, into their way of thinking, one of Labour's main focuses in a minute should be getting out into these communities. And all this mob of a dozen Labour moderate MPs is doing is once again distracting Labour from what is very essential work, because we are beginning to face quite an existential crisis with the far right, not only in this country but across the world. And Labour should be on the front foot with this issue, and yet they're still distracted, as they always are, by backroom politics brought on by Blairites, moderates, whatever you wish to call these people.
But Labour doesn't have enough people in the working class areas, in the working class constituencies. This is something that's thrown up by the Brexit paradox, you might say. Labour members, and there's a huge, huge number of them, have a lower proportion of blue-collar working-class people than probably they have ever had. And, you know, a group of momentum members from better-off places with university degrees in their back pockets and the full set of liberal prejudices and anti-prejudices, the kind of Emily Thornberry snapping a picture of the St. George's Cross and tweeting it out with a scarcely disguised sneer. This is Labour's problem too, isn't it? That it doesn't have the cadre who are of the working class and can speak to the working class, not as missionaries arrived from the better parts of Islington, but from their community themselves. You live on a housing estate, and your father comes from that working class trade union labour movement background. People like your father and you are quite rare commodities, I promise you, in today's Labour Party.
No, and I totally agree with your point. I think while there are, I mean, there are some Labour MPs who are extremely working class and have like real working class credentials. Angela Rayner, I think, is one of the most standout ones. I think I quite like her. I think she's quite often on the money. But no, you're correct. Unfortunately, there tends to be this group around Corbyn, if you like, both within the Labour Party and more broadly within supporters and within activists, who are very sort of middle-class, Islington, educated set. And that's not, you can see that it's not filtering through to the working-class communities. I mean, the Labour supporters can scream all they want, so, you know, these policies in society, but unfortunately, where it's big screaming policies at working class people coming from a different position to the people they're trying to convert, it's not going to break through. They need people actually on the ground who come from these communities. And you also see at a council level in the extreme. I mean, we all know about the notorious Council and their social cleansing. We know about Sheffield and the situation with the trees. We know about Newcastle, where another situation with felling of trees is happening as well. A lot of on-the-ground grassroots Labour politicians and campaigners are not always from the communities they're in, and not always the target audience, if you like, that they're trying to convert. And it does show. It shows in the general election results, and it also shows in some of the local election results. And I think that's an issue that really needs to be addressed, and very quickly.
Well, that's fascinating, and you taught me something I didn't know. A 4% Labour increase amongst DEs, but what did you say, 12%?
It was 7% among DEs for Labour and 12% to the Tories. The majority, more UKIP voters went to the Tories than they did Labour, which, again, these were traditional Labour communities, George. You know that as well as I do. And they have not been able to either nullify the effect of the Blair years nor convert these people to Corbyn's programme.
And you know, Corbyn is often, indeed all the time, between a rock and a hard place. And he is over Brexit in this regard too, isn't he? There are millions of UKIP voters, many of them former Labour voters and in Labour-held constituencies. If Labour doesn't get a decent share of those, and the Tories get a more than decent share, that could scupper Corbyn too.
It could indeed, absolutely. I'm not a Labour supporter. I won't be a Labour voter again. I'm not a Labour member, and I'm not a Corbynista. But I have a kind of affinity, and I feel sorry at times for Corbyn, because I don't think he ever wanted to be leader of the damned Labour Party. I think he was put in as the left-wing candidate with no expectation of winning, and he's suddenly been thrust into this position, and he is trying his level best to maintain his own value set while working with the machinery of the Labour Party. And I think you're right. I think it's a tightrope walk for Corbyn at the minute, and there's certain people within the Labour Party who are determined still to undermine him. But I think also, the Brexit issue is going to be key over the next 10 months.
And yet we don't even talk about it. We're talking about anti-Semitism instead. Steve Topple of the Canary, thanks very much indeed for joining us. Now, no sooner do I talk about Labour's lack of a working-class cadre than a working-class hero from Glasgow appears on my switchboard. It's Ricardo. Ricardo, welcome to the show.
Hello, George. I'm so glad you're on all week.
Thank you, sir. It's a good spot.
You've cured me of my Monday blues just by being on last night.
Excellent, sir.
And I'll say to you now, in case I don't get a chance, happy birthday for next week.
Thank you. Very kind of you. Thank you. Yeah,
you're the best guy I know.
Yeah, the wife thinks I'm only 45, so keep the number quiet, yeah?
I was planning on it. But
Okay.
you're the best guy I know, and God bless you. And I pray for you and Mrs. Galloway every day.
Thank you, Ricardo. God bless you too. Go ahead, sir.
Now, momentum.
Yes.
I've been signed up to the momentum movement since it started 3 years
There's
ago.
a lot of good people in it, yeah? I'm not really much of a fan of their leadership, and that was before they threw Pete Wilsman to the wolves. I think unsuccessfully, actually, but didn't seem like the right kind of spirit under fire.
Correct. I've been signed up to Momentum since it started 3 years ago, and until recently I was proud to be in Momentum. But I fear now that this group is in need of a name change because it's quickly coming to a standstill. I was heavily discouraged last week when they suddenly made this announcement that they weren't going to endorse Pete Wilsman for the NEC. And this was promptly picked up and endorsed by Paul Mason, Owen Jones, their usual suspects, but not just them. It was Rachel Shabby, who's a much more respectable journalist on the left, and Rhea Wilson, Mark Zard's cousin. All these promising figures on the left willingly gave in to the right-wing bullying.
And if they had their way, of course, Corbyn's two-person majority on the NEC would become a one-person majority on the NEC, and some of that majority are distinctly wobbly. It was a self-disfiguring act.
Well, Rhea Wilson's one of them. She's on the NEC, and
she's coming off, though, isn't she? She's not standing again.
She's not standing any longer. That's absolutely correct. But lots of people left Momentum that same day, and I might not even have continued as a member myself, were it not for the fact that in Scotland, Momentum's an affiliate group. Momentum technically doesn't exist in Scotland.
That's right. It's the Campaign for Socialism, isn't it?
It's part of a much more democratic group, which, unlike Momentum, the Scottish Labour Campaign for Socialism is a group within Labour, made entirely of Labour members, and when it makes statements, those statements are on behalf of the members. And that's the problem with Momentum now. It was set up with the intention of being a ground-up, grassroots movement within Labour.
Well, that might have been your intention, Ricardo, and the intention of many thousands who joined it. I think approaching 50,000 have joined it. But in fact, it's a private company, and one person owns that company.
It's become the face. It's become a cool face with John Landsman's voice. And indeed, with Landsman standing alongside Pete Wilsman, this is borderline grounds to have him removed from the NEC, because Code of Conduct requires NEC candidates not to comment on other candidates during the selection.
Well, I didn't know that. That is interesting. I mean, don't get me wrong, Ricardo. If I had a vote, I'd be voting for all 9, including Landsman, because the others are worse than Landsman.
The alternative's worse. I mean, if Landsman doesn't get in, it's going to be Eddie Izzard, who not only is he about as funny as a Labour NEC meeting, in my opinion, he is not one to be trusted. And there's theories going around that he's the one that recorded these comments at Pete Wilson. I wouldn't want to get into that.
I don't know if it was. It was certainly somebody that was phoning in to the meeting. That much has been technologically established. Not that there's any inquiry going on into it, of course.
Well, I would be much more comfortable saying that if there was some sort of inquiry. I like theories, but I prefer more.
Yes, of course.
More substance.
Now, look, turning Ricardo to this issue of the Fair Oak Farm conspiracy.
Yeah.
Do you think there's anything in it? Has the ring of truth to me.
Again, it's another theory with not that much substance. But
well, we've got one MP admitting he was there, and he couldn't have been there on his own because he says it was for policy discussions. And even Chris Leslie doesn't talk to himself.
He might do. He's mad enough to. But the only thing that's been said is that Corbyn's name doesn't get mentioned, and I'm actually happy to accept that, because I think they have a plethora of nicknames for him. I don't think they call him Mr. Corbyn at these meetings. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
But they're free to leave any time they like, as far as we're concerned. The Labour Party membership. The anti-Semitism card is all they have left, and you can spend your whole life trying to prove these smears are bunkum, which most of them are. But even if you prove it, the evidence means nothing to them. They'll bang on about it until they're pushed or they jump.
Well, look, Margaret Hodge's case was abandoned last night while we were on the air, and she's used the 24 hours since to flay her party further. Yes. She said there was no apologies either side, and she then tweeted her lawyer's letter, which claimed Labour had apologised to her.
That's absolutely right, and it's an outrage to the democracy of the Labour Party. And with this gap, with everyone falling, no longer trusting Momentum, there is a place for a real grassroots movement that isn't afraid to call these Blairites out, people who refuse to be silenced or compromised by the likes of the Blairite wing. And like Momentum, it doesn't have to be within Labour. And George, I have to say, you and Ken Livingston should consider that. You find you have a lot of support within the Labour Party and out with the Labour Party.
Well, thank you for that. Ken and I are speaking in Liverpool on the 8th of September. I'm sure that will be one of the items for discussion. One thing's for sure, Ricardo, neither Ken nor I are ready to go quietly into that good night. Thank you for all your kind words and for your wise observations, Ricardo in Glasgow. Now, I need your calls, 0344 499 1000, but you can also email the show through the website at talkradio.co.uk. You can text the word talk and then your message to 87222, or you can tweet me for free because the texts cost 25 pence plus normal sending charges, but you can tweet entirely free at George Galloway at Talk Radio. A lot of people have been in touch. Owen in Mirfield says Margaret Hodge takes up the olive branch she's offered and proceeds to use it to flay her party further. That's not particularly dame-like. I don't know, as the song says, Owen, there's nothing like a dame. Tony on the email says, George, I was just looking at the latest betting odds that might cheer you up. The Labour Party are now odds-on favourite to win the coming election, and Jeremy Corbyn is clear favourite to be the next Prime Minister. Ignore the polls because the bookies rarely get it wrong. You're right, Tony, about that, and indeed therein lies the essence of the matter. None of this would be happening if Jeremy Corbyn were unelectable, to coin a phrase. Georgina says the Dirty Dozen, the Clueless 11, follow Tory values, and so closely that lying must be second nature. Of course, they've been discussing our top bloke, but they're more Mr. Bean than 007. Amanda says, this is a surprising one, people are joining the Labour Party in their droves. I joined in 2016 after Corbyn was viciously attacked for what he wore. I was a Tory voter before that. I'm sure the mainstream media didn't intend for that, but clearly this plan is still backfiring. Very interesting, Amanda. Thanks for that. And David Leviscont says, hi, GG, we've arrived at times when our enemies are not on foreign shores. The enemy of the people and the country is our own media. It is a disgrace, and they should be ashamed, and more to the point, we should hold them accountable. A lot of people are switching off the BBC on Thursday night. I'm certainly one of them, and maybe the organisers of that will call into the show and explain what it's all about. Chris from Liverpool. George, how about they call themselves the Collapsing Centre Party? Love the show. Thank you, Chris. Hope to see you at St George's Hall on the 8th of September, my friend. The Communicipalist says the reason the poorest people in England voted Tory is Brexit. They feel that all the other parties have deserted any pretence of respecting democracy and our vote to leave. That is why Labour loses support to the far right in working class communities. Well said, Mr. Communicipalist. And here's an unnamed texter. If anyone keeps May in power for a decade, it's not the Blairites. It's your heroine, the Brexit blood sports enthusiast, Hoy, who voted with the government. Not sure that kept them in power for the next decade, but the gutless coward who spends a fortune texting me at 25 pence plus normal sending charges every single time I'm on the radio has sent two. He doesn't give his name, and of course he won't phone up. No political party will ever cut through to the working class who continually preach PC liberal ideologies and virtue signal their fake compassion. That's Chris, who in one text shows vividly that he ain't working class himself. Here's Chris in Colchester on the line. Go ahead, Chris.
Hi, George.
Hi.
Yeah, I don't know if I planted a seed last Friday, but I mentioned Ron Paul. Maybe I'm giving myself too much credit. But,
no, you're not. You did plant a seed, and my dear friend Ryan landed the fish.
Oh, great. It's really great to have him on, and I look forward to that later. I mean, I remember when he was presidential candidate, and he almost got booed out of the building for sort of suggesting the United States faces antagonism from other people around the world because of their foreign policy.
Yeah,
and it was just...
he was right about that. He opposed the Iraq war, he opposed the Afghan adventure, he opposed the Syria war, he opposes the threats of war everywhere.
Yeah, he's been consistent on that, and he's probably one of the best presidents the United States will never have, unfortunately. But yeah, I just about the whole funding thing, where the money's coming from. I'm not making any claims or anything, but I just read online. I was looking around, and there's a guy called Michael Foster who's put a lot of donations into Liz Kendall, and he gave her money to. I've read that for her to run against Jeremy Corbyn in the last attempted coup.
He's the one who said that Corbyn's supporters were a new Gestapo.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, he's got a real grudge. I just reading through his Twitter feed. It's quite evident what the kind of things he believes, but it's quite.
He doesn't have the price of £50 million though, Chris. Trust me on that.
No.
He's one of these people that likes to show they're far richer than they are. He's a bit Donald Trump in that regard. I'll tell you where I suspect the money is coming from. I believe it's coming from Europe. I believe it's coming not from the official coffers of the EU, of course, but from the caravan that moves in support of the EU. And I demand to know if there is any foreign money coming in to fund a British political party, because that would, of course, be illegal.
Yeah, we need to find out. It's very important, and it's complete farce to democracy. But also, I think with Corbyn, if he just keeps apologising like he does and backing into a corner, it doesn't bode well. I mean, people like me who've got a slight temptation to vote for him, it puts me off, because he's showing leadership qualities like that, and he's got the truth on his side in most of these matters, and he's got evidence to point against them, and it's a real litmus test, because we've seen what happens since Donald Trump's been elected. It's been a wave of hysteria every single day, Russia this, Russia that, and it will be the same with Corbyn, I believe, if he ever becomes Prime Minister. So it's not going to go away. So I think he needs to show some backbone, but I don't think he's like that. I just think he's too nice.
Well, I put my own tuppence worth in at the very beginning of all this business, and I wouldn't have needed an IHRA definition, and certainly not the long list of examples. It would have been simple. That anti-Semitism is racism. There is zero tolerance for racism in the Labour Party, and that has nothing to do with our attitude towards Israel as a state, which is a foreign state like any other foreign state, and anyone in British politics is entitled to criticise it without being called a racist. And I would have fought that there and then, right from the very beginning. But Jeremy Corbyn began retreating, and I was brought up to the maxim, if you don't run, they can't chase you. They might, of course, be able to overwhelm you, but in that case, I would take recourse in La Passionaria's great words that it's better to die on your feet than to live forever on your knees. Exactly, and I believe that he would have resisted successfully the onslaught if he had fought it at the right time. But that's not where we are now. We are where we are. He has accepted the IHRA definition. I think he should now accept all of the examples except one. And that one is point G, which would make it impossible to describe Israel as an apartheid state, to describe it as a racist endeavour, which it quite obviously is, because it's just put that in its own constitution. So, it would be positively Orwellian to make it an expellable offence to say, as a Labour Party member, what hundreds of thousands of Israelis are saying, what Haaretz, the most respected Israeli newspaper, is saying, what Daniel Barenboim, the magnificent composer and pianist and conductor, Barenboim said quite categorically, this new constitution makes Israel an apartheid state. Now, if it's good enough for Daniel, it's got to be good enough for Chris in Colchester, no?
Yeah, definitely. And to be honest, they've been an apartheid state before that anyway.
Yeah, for sure. But now they've made it official.
Yeah, and I think a lot of this whole anti-Semitism thing is definitely connected to what they've done with that law, and also with their actions in Gaza. executing people. It's a deflection.
Yeah.
And it's plain to see. But there's just one thing. I respect Peter Hitchens a lot, and I've always admired him. But when it comes to Israel-Palestine, it's just terrible. I mean, he wrote a piece last week saying about Alan Dershowitz's Case for Israel being an interesting book, and he seemed to put Palestinians in brackets, like they don't exist kind of thing, that they just appeared in 1967 as a propaganda weapon. But that book has been debunked and destroyed by Norman Finkelstein in Beyond Chutzpah, and there's a debate between Norman Finkelstein and Alan Dershowitz where he absolutely decimates him, and everyone should watch it because, it's basic Zionist arguments against facts.
Well, look, Professor Finkelstein is what's known nowadays as the wrong type of Jew. He is a man who lost many family members in the Holocaust, but that doesn't count in his favour in the way that it counts in the favour of Dame Margaret Hodge. Chris in Colchester, thank you very much indeed for that. That brings to an end the first hour of the mother of all talk shows. Luckily, there's 2 more to go. Now, at midnight tonight, Eastern Standard Time in the USA, that's 5 a.m. our time here in London, a new tranche of reimposed economic sanctions is put in place by the government of the United States, by the President Donald Trump. It has caused already a major fissure with some of America's closest allies and with the international community as organized, because it is a unilateral breach of a multilateral treaty between the permanent 5 of the Security Council plus 1, that one being the EU. The EU is not accepting Trump's decision to tear up the Iran nuclear deal, organized at very great effort by many people, diplomats from many countries over many years. And the EU today put in place its blocking clause, which has existed from 1996 but has never been used. And that blocking clause is to give legal and financial protection to private companies operating in the EU, following their own country's national laws and continuing to trade with Iran. Donald Trump, however, has said in no uncertain terms, if you trade with Iran, you will not trade with the United States. And notwithstanding the EU's determination and its triggering of the blocking clause, the companies of the European Union have begun to jump ship. I heard earlier that Daimler-Benz in Germany have been the first company to say that notwithstanding the EU and the German government's position, it will be rolling over and crying Uncle Sam. Now, the sanctions that go into place in the early hours of the morning, our time, are the first of 2 tranches of sanctions. The more savage will be introduced in November. And in November, we could be on a course to war. I don't think that's alarmist, because I'm pretty sure that the Iranians are not going to go quietly into the good night of economic siege, embargo, and sanctions to death. Barbara Slavin is the director of the Future of Iran initiative at the Atlantic Council, and she kindly joins us now. Barbara, thank you for coming on the show.
You're quite welcome.
Tell me how you see the first tranche of sanctions affecting Iran and affecting European countries.
Yeah, well, I think it's a bit anticlimactic in a way, because much of the damage to the Iranian economy has come in the run-up to the sanctions. Ever since President Trump was elected, the deal, which was reached 3 years ago, has been cast into uncertainty. A lot of companies began by basically treading water, then postponing agreements that they'd made with the Iranians. And then it became clearer and clearer, really from last October, that he was going to pull out, as he had threatened to do. And so we've seen companies, there's been a sort of steady exodus, really for months now. And the damage that was done to the Iranian currency is the most severe. The currency, the rial, essentially collapsed. It's lost more than half its value just in the last few months. And that's what's really hurt the Iranians. Ironically, today, the currency actually strengthened a bit when people realized, well, okay, this set of sanctions is in, and we know what we have to deal with now.
Now, what's Trump's problem with the Iran deal? Is it merely that it's got Barack Obama's signature on it, or what is it?
That's really one of the main reasons. In case anyone hasn't noticed, the president fancies himself a great negotiator, and he thinks he can walk into a room with the leader of another country and in the space of 90 minutes do better than, hundreds of diplomats and technocrats working for years and years on something as complicated as the Iran nuclear deal, which I think is 139 pages long. So
that's way too much for Trump to read.
Yeah, he only reads, little
139 words, characters,
color-coded index cards. So yeah, I think a lot of it has to do with ego. A lot of it also has to do with the way he sees the Middle East. He has entirely bought into the views of Israel, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates. And they have told him that this is a bad deal.
Is it not them that's bought into him, Barbara? The Saudis and the Emiratis seem to be very cozy with the Trump family.
They do indeed. Yes, they do indeed. And so he's partly doing their bidding. He's partly acting on the assumption that, he can produce a better deal. And we should point out that he has offered now several times in the last week or so to meet with his Iranian counterpart, Rouhani. So it's not out of the realm of possibility that we would actually have such a conversation, although I think the Iranians understandably are demanding that the United States first come back into compliance with the nuclear deal.
Well, Rouhani is my former constituent, I must tell you, and I got him a council house in a block of high flats in Glasgow. I hope he remembers that. But the offer that Trump made, and you're right, he's made it several times, was without preconditions. But Pompeo quickly added quite a lot of conditions.
Yes, he did. But, the president is the president. So if by some miracle the Iranians were to agree, I suppose he could override his Secretary of State. I think the real question is whether Iran will try to seek some sort of meeting with the United States, maybe at the upcoming UN General Assembly. Right now, they're playing hard to get, but, there have been some rumors of indirect contacts. It would be appropriate for the foreign ministers, for Pompeo to meet with Javad Zarif, the Iranian foreign minister, as a start. But, Trump likes to go right to the top, so I'm not sure.
Well, he does, yes.
That's the starter.
And, of course, Rouhani isn't the top in the Iranian political system. It's the head of the Council of Guardians, Ayatollah Khamenei, who is really the top. And I think he's taking a very hard line. But we have, as you alluded, been here before in relation to North Korea. A couple of months before, we were seriously discussing on this show whether war would break out between the United States and North Korea. And then before you could rustle up a pot noodle, there was Trump sitting with him in Singapore. So it could happen again.
Yeah, I think it's unlikely. First, the supreme leader is not going to meet with Donald Trump. He rarely meets with foreign leaders, and they have to come to Tehran to meet with him. He does not leave. The country hasn't left it since the 1980s when he was president. So, the thought of him getting on a plane and coming to meet
to Singapore.
Trump, no, I don't think so. the Iranians don't do photo op diplomacy. They have a very painstaking
Yes, they're quite
way of going
austere
about
people.
these
They're
things.
the antithesis of the Trump approach.
Very much so, and many extremely qualified people in their foreign ministry who have international law degrees, and so no, I don't see that. But if there could be some diminution of tension, obviously that's something we would all welcome. Um, a lot of Iranians, like a lot of Americans, are waiting to see what happens in our midterm elections. If Trump loses one house of Congress, that will weaken him. They may begin to see him as just being a one-term president, and they've been through agonizing sanctions before. There's going to be more evasion this time because the international community is not supporting the United States, so they might hunker down and just try to get through the next couple of years.
And of course, it will have the precise opposite effect to undermining the regime, because I know Iran quite well, and my take is that even those who don't like the regime, the system, and there are many of those, are Iranian nationalists. I mean, there are a lot of Islamists in Iran, but there are, in my experience, more Iranian nationalists. And they will take a foreign siege like this as a call, a duty to them to rally round the flag, don't you think?
Well, I'm not exactly sure of that. I've been to Iran a number of times as well, and people have complained about their government as long as I can remember. I think people are really demoralized now because the nuclear deal raised a lot of hopes and a lot of expectations. And even though it may well be that the United States is the one that's violated the agreement, Iranians are not thrilled by their government's foreign policy, by its intervention in places like Syria and Yemen and Lebanon and on the Palestinian issue. And I think we've heard in the slogans that people have been chanting at protests, which have been going on now for months, that they would like their government to focus on Iranian internal matters. And if Iran were to draw back a bit in the region, I'm not saying it's going to happen. I don't think it will. But if they were to do that, then Trump could, claim success and say that he achieved what Obama never did. And isn't this wonderful? So there are different ways to look at this. I mean, in Syria, the massive Iranian intervention may be coming to a close now that Assad has consolidated control. The Iranians always say that they're looking for a settlement in Yemen. It's only the Saudis who have been balking at that. So, it is conceivable. I'm not a supporter of President Trump. I don't think he has any diplomatic finesse whatsoever. But in a certain blundering way, we might get to some compromises that would actually make things better. We have to hope anyway.
Well, let's talk again, if you will, Barbara, in November when we see if there's been any October surprises. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Barbara Slavin, Director of the Future of Iran Initiative at the Atlantic Council. Give me your calls on Donald Trump, on Iran, on the Fair Oak Farm conspiracy. 5, or was it 11, or was it the Dirty Dozen who went into the luxury farmhouse spread in Sussex, but never mentioned Jeremy Corbyn's name? Just policy development, you know what I mean? 0344 499 1000, that's the number to call. They better hope that I didn't bug the farm. You can email me at talkradio.co.uk, or you can text me. Text the word talk and then your message to 87222, though that will cost you 25 pence plus normal sending charges. But you can tweet me at George Galloway at Talk Radio. In the final hour, we're talking to the legendary Ron Paul, former Texas congressman, former presidential hopeful, father of Senator Rand Paul, who's still right at the centre of politics in the United States today. And Ron Paul, through the Ron Paul Institute, is constantly opining on the great issues of the day, including the one I've just been discussing with Barbara Slavin, the director of the Future of Iran Initiative at the Atlantic Council. Let's hear from Paul in Manchester. Go ahead, Paul.
Hello, good evening, George.
Evening, sir.
Yeah, may I talk about Boris Johnson, please?
Yes, please do. Yes, we never tire of it.
Well, he's controversial. He's ridiculous. But why do you think he wants to court controversy? What's all that about?
I think it's a dog whistle and probably a starting pistol, if I can mix the metaphor, for the dog race that will be underway after the Tory party conference. That's my take on it. He certainly did it deliberately. He knows very well that as the former Foreign Secretary, to make such comments in a newspaper once august, like the Daily Telegraph, is an extraordinarily incendiary thing to do. So he did it deliberately.
Well, if he's got ambitions of being the leader of the Tory party, isn't he going about it the wrong way, do you think?
Well, maybe. Depends how high an opinion you've got of the Tory party. You might argue that what he did plays right into the barrel of the Tory party's membership. Don't forget, he's got two hurdles, Paul. He's got to be in the top two nominated by the Tory MPs. In other words, he's got to be the Brexit candidate. That means he's got to see off other potential Brexit candidates. He's got to put clear blue water between himself and them. And then, if he does get into the top two, he's got to rustle the petticoats out in the shires amongst the rather elderly membership of the Conservative Party. And perhaps this kind of dog whistle might do him some good there.
Yeah, well, I mean, what I like about the Tory party is nothing you can put on the back of a postage stamp. But Boris Johnson, I really dislike the bloke. I mean, I don't know anybody who purposely ruffles their hair up. What's all that about?
Yeah, well, he's a showman, isn't he? And again, he's putting, these are USPs of his, the Latin, the erudition, the pound shop Winston Churchill act, the deliberate ruffling of his hair, going out scantily clad for jogs when he's 10 stone overweight. All of these are intended to signal that he's a larger-than-life character.
Yeah, even though he does look ridiculous when he's riding his mountain bike. But that being said, I think he's gone too far this time, insulting Muslim women. I mean, that's the chosen dress, and I don't know much about their faith, but it is their faith.
Well, you know, imagine if he'd done it about, say, the Jewish faith. Imagine if he'd written that about how Orthodox Jewish women dress. He'd be finished, right? I mean, we wouldn't even be talking about him. He'd be out of Parliament already.
Well, yes, but imagine if Jeremy Corbyn had said what he said. You know, I mean,
no, it was very, very extreme, and the more so as until very recently he was Britain's chief diplomat abroad. It was therefore deliberate. It was no kind of slip. It wasn't an off-the-cuff remark. It was a studied comment in a very expensively purchased newspaper article. He's the highest paid writer in Britain, other than J.K. Rowling. The Telegraph is effectively sponsoring his political career. I mean, the money he's getting is completely incomparable with any other journalistic endeavour. And so the Telegraph want him to be saying these kind of things. I mean, there's a billboard round the corner from me with his face on it telling you to buy the Telegraph so you can read Boris Johnson. So from the Telegraph's point of view, they're investing in him in the hope that he gets the top gig.
Well, I'll tell you something, George. God help us all if the like of him gets into...
Well, you know, you get the Prime Minister you vote for, and in a contest between Jeremy Corbyn and Boris Johnson, or a contest between Jeremy Corbyn and Jacob Rees-Mogg, I'm quite confident what the outcome would be, and so are the bookies.
Yes, and the media, the press, they're doing everything.
Well, that's why they're doing it. Yeah, I mean, we shouldn't lose sight of this. They're doing what they're doing, which is unprecedented. It's reached a base level, a sewer level that has never been seen before in British politics. And I've lived through a lot of these things, Paul, as have you. I've lived through the demonisation of Mr. Benn. I've lived through the demonisation of Mr. Scargill, of many other characters on the left. But there's never been anything remotely like this, day after day, year after year. And yet, if you look at the opinion poll today, it's 38% Labour, 38% Conservative. And that's without a 4-week general election campaign, when the broadcasters are at least are forced to give some kind of balance, as opposed to the imbalance of the BBC at the minute. I saw a figure that coverage on the BBC of Labour's so-called anti-Semitism problem is more than 1,000% greater than coverage of the Conservative Party's Islamophobia problem, accentuated further by Boris Johnson's comments this week. 1,000%, just imagine that. But once a general election is called, as we found last time, Corbyn can make up fantastic ground. He was 20 points behind Theresa May when the general election started. So all of this is because Corbyn is the bookies' favourite, and because Labour are the bookies' favourites to form the next government. Paul, thanks very much indeed for your call. Ray is in Frome in Somerset. Goodness me, Ray, I spoke there in the run-up to the war 15 years ago. Frome, lovely little place. Go ahead.
Cylinders again?
Who have I got here now? Have I got Ray?
Ray.
Yeah.
It's Ray.
It's you, Ray. On you go. I was just talking fondly about my memories in Frome. 15 years ago I spoke there.
Yep.
During the run-up to the war. Anyway, go on, say your piece.
Just talk about these coup merchants.
Yes.
They've got no hopes of unseating Corbyn, and they know it.
Sure, that's not what they're meeting about. They're meeting about a new party.
It's Plan B, isn't it? It's Plan B to stop a Labour, stop a Corbyn government. That's what it is. I mean, a lot of them have got safe seats. They're not bothered if a Tory government comes in. They'll be on there £200,000 or £300,000 a year. They're not bothered if a Tory government comes in. They don't want to do anything but to stop a Corbyn Labour.
Do you think they would hold their seats?
It's not about seating Corbyn.
How many of them would hold their seats? I mean, the leader is undoubtedly Chuka Umunna. He's got the Stardust. He's the MP for Streatham. I lived there for more than 20 years, left there comparatively recently. I've got to tell you, there's no chance that Chuka Umunna would hold Streatham against against a good Labour candidate.
Some of them would, though. Like I don't know how many would, but this is why have they got the guts to do it? They're gutless cowards. I don't know whether any of them have got the guts to do it. You know what I mean?
Well, I mean, somebody's paying them, somebody's funding them. I assure you, because I know these people, they weren't taking the 7.29 out of Waterloo every other week for £149 per night long weekend at the Fair Oak Farm. They weren't doing that at their own expense. I can promise you that.
It's a different kettle of fish now, isn't it? A different party now. You haven't got McNichol there protecting them now. The NEC's been pretty effective and cowardly just lately, I think. It's the CLPs now that hold the power now. I mean, it looks like Hodge CLP are going to get rid of her.
Well, she was probably going to retire next time anyway, and I promise you, she'll be reborn, not as Dame Margaret Hodge, but as Baroness Margaret Hodge.
But they'll be standing as independents, won't they? Unless Labour really caves in and lets them stand as Labour candidate, I can't believe they're going to let them do that.
Well, we'll see. Ray, thank you very much indeed for the call. let me take a break and then I want to talk about the earthquake in Indonesia. Now, as some of you know, my good wife is Indonesian. Many of my in-laws lived there, and I have been several times to the country. Their people and their beautiful country means a lot to me, and so you can imagine the more than consternation in our house when we heard of the Indonesian earthquake, which struck Lombok with a 6.9 magnitude just the other night. It has now known to have killed nearly 100 people. It's left 20,000 people homeless and sent thousands of tourists fleeing because, of course, Bali is in the area. And I saw a picture just this evening of David Beckham and his family amongst the tourists who were fleeing. So a state of chaos, I'm sure, in the area. But as always, when a state of chaos ensues, so descend the Red Cross and the Red Crescent to save lives and to repair damaged communities. Matthew Cochrane is the spokesperson of the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, and he joins us now on the line from Switzerland. Matthew, thank you for that.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Describe, if you would, what happened in Indonesia, how serious it was.
Well, the earthquake, as you said, struck on Sunday evening local time, struck the island of Lombok, which is just adjacent to Bali. From what I've come to understand over the last couple of days, speaking to colleagues on the ground in Indonesia, the worst affected parts of the island were to the north. Just a couple of hours ago, I spoke with a colleague of mine who's in Lombok, and he travelled out to some of the villages that were accessible, and he described an exceptionally destructive disaster. He talked about going through villages, small villages, rural villages that have been abandoned, that have totally collapsed. We're seeing this as it's a disaster-prone country, as you well know, and while it might not be as big as some of the disasters it's experienced over the past decade, it's a major disaster for the communities affected, and they will need a lot of support over the months and possibly even years ahead.
Now, up to 100 have died. I don't know if you know how many are injured, but the number of 20,000 homeless is a significant number, isn't it?
It is, and I suspect that number might actually rise. You probably recall that there was an earthquake about a week ago in Lombok. And so following that, it was a much smaller earthquake and did much less damage. About 10,000 people were already homeless and living in shelters or out in the open. So one of the issues that colleagues on the ground are experiencing is access. First of all, communication lines were down and electricity were down, so it was very difficult to get information from more remote areas. But also physical access. Roads have been cut, so it's been difficult to physically get into these areas. So the story I'm being told is that we can anticipate that some of these numbers will climb until we have a full picture of just how bad the impact is.
Is 6.9 a particularly large earthquake, or was there something country-specific or territory-specific that has led to this level of damage?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm not an expert on earthquakes. I've been in a few myself, and they're terrifying. I've never been in one as large as 6.9, so I can't imagine how violent that must have felt. Colleagues who know more about this than I do always say that it's not just the magnitude, it's the depth, and that shallower earthquakes can be especially destructive, and obviously it takes into account bedrock and soil and the location, the population density. But my understanding is that this one was particularly devastating because it was actually relatively shallow. It was about 15 kilometres under the surface of the earth, and it just seemed to have kind of hit an area where there was already high vulnerability, where buildings had already been damaged by the previous earthquake, and that's why it's done so much damage.
Now, Indonesia is not a poor country, though there are many poor people who live in it. How have the local authorities responded?
Well, the response is still building. The Indonesian Red Cross has been responding really since the minutes after, involved in things like search and rescue and first aid. Indonesia is a country with a lot of competence in disaster response. It's competence that comes from experience, basically. They respond to so many emergencies on a daily and a weekly basis. They know what they're doing. But the dialogue we're having with our colleagues at the Indonesian Red Cross at the moment is that because of the earlier earthquake and because of the severity of this earthquake, they will need additional support from around the world. The government's not asking for international assistance, but one of the privileges we have as the Red Cross is that we're present there because we are in Indonesia. We are Indonesians. We are the Indonesian Red Cross, and so they've asked us to provide support. So we would plan to go public with an international call for assistance in the coming days. The response has been good, but when there's needs that outweigh the local capacity, it's our responsibility as an international community to answer those calls.
Will you be making a financial appeal?
Yeah, we will. I think so. I mean, I gave a very roundabout answer to your previous question, sorry. But no, I think we will be making a public appeal in the next 24 hours or so, probably in the range of, I would say in the range of 7 or 8 million Swiss francs. I think that's about 5 or 6 million pounds. You'd have to check, though, the exchange rate.
Well, we have to check the exchange rate here every day, mate.
Yeah.
Thank you, Matthew Cochrane, the international spokesperson of the Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. Coming up at 9 o'clock, we've got the legendary Ron Paul, former Texan congressman and presidential hopeful. And we're taking your calls, of course, already on the Fair Oak Farm conspiracy, 5 or 11 or 12, who knows, who went every other Thursday rather, from Waterloo to a luxury farm spread to discuss policy development. And as far as one of the participants, the only admitted participant so far, Chris Leslie MP, the name of Jeremy Corbyn, didn't come up at all at any of the sessions. Sounds extraordinary. 0344 499 1000. We're talking also about Donald Trump's new sanctions on Iran, which begin in the middle of the night. Following this, at 5 a.m. London time, a new range of economic sanctions, embargo, quarantine, an act of war will be placed by the United States unilaterally on Iran. Everybody else in the world except Israel, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates are opposed to Trump's new actions and will be even more opposed to the much worse series of sanctions he intends to impose in November. Let's hear from Eileen in Exmouth. Go ahead, Eileen.
Oh, hello, George. Hi. Thank you for taking my call.
Nice to hear from you.
Thank you. I'm not going to talk about anything you've just mentioned, I'm afraid, but I just wanted to share with you, I don't know if you know, but I live in London and I'm in a very safe Labour seat in London. And I also have a home in Exmouth, and in East Devon is just another world. And for the last year, maybe 2 years, what I do is I spend my time talking to people who just strangers on the street. So basically, I try every day to talk to somebody, and I just talk to them about anything that comes up, and then I always make it go around to the Labour Party and Jeremy Corbyn and the hope that I have that we can change things.
And how does it play down in Exmouth?
Well, it's interesting. I would say up to a few months ago, certainly a year ago, no one was really interested. They hadn't even heard of Jeremy Corbyn. They don't do politics, all that sort of thing. They were very nice to me, but I could sense that they just thought I was a bit odd. But now there's a definite change. I was talking to two lovely ladies today, and they were just so engaged in the conversation, and they just said that they just realised that something isn't quite right. And it's things are really, really changing, but slowly. It's really hard work and slow, laborious work, but things are changing. And I just say to them, it doesn't have to be like this. And then I go through the whole rigmarole of the corporations not paying their taxes and offshore tax havens and privatisation of the NHS and so on and so forth. I mean, that's the one that gets everybody. Nobody seems to even know the NHS is being privatised. But I do find that people are opening up and are much more aware that something's not right.
Well, all the polling, Eileen, shows that Corbyn's manifesto is enormously popular, much more popular than he is, although he's not remotely as unpopular as he once was. And one of the, we experienced this before, I remember when Ken Livingstone ran the GLC. Of course, the media was much smaller then, much more compact then. But Ken Livingstone, as leader of the GLC, was subjected to really extraordinary smears on a daily basis. But actually, he became more and more popular. So sometimes, as Chairman Mao said, you can struggle mightily to lift a huge stone, only to drop it on your own feet.
Yes, but I also think that I go around my daily life pretending there's no such thing as media, because obviously the print press and the BBC are just a waste of time for people like me. So I just assume that there's nothing, and I talk to people as if they've never heard anything, and it becomes like a Chinese whisper. So I say something to them, and they pass it on to somebody else, and it literally is a Chinese whisper just moving around the country. And I think that's the only way we can do it.
Well, you're a one-woman crusade in this regard. I wish you well. You've chosen rather inhospitable, politically speaking, territory in Exmouth, I'm sure. If Labour takes Exmouth, there'll be a revolution in this country, won't there?
Well, I tell you what, I'd be so proud if we could do something. I really would. It would be amazing. Because everybody tells me it's impossible, and I just say to them, no, it's not. Nothing's impossible.
Well, what wonderful spirit. Eileen in Exmouth, don't be a stranger, and call back soon. 0344 499 1000, that's the number to call. You can also email through the website, talkradio.co.uk. You can text the word talk to 87222, followed by your message, but that'll cost you 25 pence plus normal sending charges. You can tweet me, of course, free at George Galloway at Talk Radio. Joe Vaz has on the email said, I'm a listener from Canada. I love your show and point of view. We have the same kind of stuff going on in Canada as you talk about. The latest is Canada and the Saudis having a major incident over Canadian criticism of Saudi human rights relating to two people being locked up. Canada stands for values, as said by Justin, but never a mention of human rights issues in Gaza, Palestinians, etc., or Yemen. Please mention. That's from Joe Vaz. Joe, thanks for that. Thanks for listening in Canada. And to all those who are listening in foreign climes, Justin Trudeau has a very highly selective attitude to human rights, that's sure. But even a stopped clock is right twice a day, and Trudeau is right about Saudi Arabia. And the response of Saudi Arabia was a deeply sinister one, and may even have included a coded threat that Canada will pay in some indeterminate way for its stance on Saudi human rights. I found it at least quite chilling. Lizzie says, first time I've listened to Talk Radio, I have never went nuts with despair with every nasty party supporting presenter on a local London radio station, on BBC News and Sky News. I suggest to that local London radio station that to me it means leading bullies of Corbyn. I will stay tuned to Talk Radio. Love your voice. Thank you, Lizzie. That's very, very kind. I'm always glad when a sinner doth repent. Friedrich Kolenda says on the email, George, why did you let this Atlantic Council prostitute go away undisputed? She spewed the old neocon Zionist myths about Iranian meddling. You should better have made her talk about US nurturing of ISIS and other terrorists. Best greetings from Bavaria. There you go, from Canada to Bavaria. Well, the way I look at it, Friedrich, I'm, first of all, never rude to my guests because that's my culture. I certainly would never dream of describing the lady in question as a prostitute, because I have no evidence at all that she is. Of course, I know the Atlantic Council is a neocon construct, but my attitude to interviews is to let people speak their truth, and then I speak mine. And that has the added advantage of keeping the regulator off our back, keeping the management happy, and most importantly, keeping guests coming back for more. Did you get my drift, Friedrich in Bavaria? Frank in Dumbarton. Let's hear what he has to say. Go ahead, Frank.
Hi, George.
Hi.
George, I was just wondering what your thoughts are on Alex Jones losing his platform. I'm just wondering, what do you think it says about freedom of speech?
Well,
I don't know, I'm not a fan of it myself, but, everybody's got the kind of right to say what they say. If they take him down, who they take him down next?
I still haven't seen, Frank, what the offending articles were, but I know enough about him.
Apparently, George, he was apparently meant to be banned for 90 days or something, and he kept appearing on other people's shows. He's meant to stay off. And apparently they banned him for that. But I don't think it was. I think it was the Sandy Hook stuff that's really pushed him over the edge.
Well, I was going to mention the Sandy Hook stuff, which is so deeply repugnant.
It was.
It's either suppurating evil or it is utter insanity. But if you or I were the parents of a school child that was murdered at Sandy Hook, would we think highly of Apple and Facebook if they were allowing someone to claim that you and I were not actually grieving over our dead child, but that our dead child was an actor, and that we were actors, that nobody was murdered at Sandy Hook, that it was all a Barack Obama conspiracy to ban guns, which were never in any case banned? I think that there are issues of freedom of speech, and of course he still has freedom to speak, but there's also a freedom for private companies at the end of the day to say, we don't actually want your content on our platform. And of course freedom of speech has limits in any case. It has limits of law. I could not accuse you of entirely false and defamatory things here now, or I'd be in serious trouble. It has limits of taste. It has limits of incitement to racial and religious hatred and so on. So there are obvious limits to freedom of speech. It wouldn't be able to stop me standing on a street corner and spouting evil. But I think it's a bit difficult to say that Apple and co. have a duty to provide a platform to someone like Alex Jones, who is spouting that kind of thing. The same goes for Tommy Robinson. He's been banned today on Instagram and allegedly on Twitter, though I haven't seen that confirmed. You see, does he have the right to incite racial and religious hatred? For me, no. Nobody has that right. You can have these thoughts. You can scribble on walls these exhortations to racial and religious hatred. But I don't think a radio station or a TV station or a social media platform has an obligation to let you do it on their walls. Do you know what I'm saying, Frank?
Yeah, I totally understand, George. People call the internet it's like the public square kind of thing, today's public square and a town square, whatever you like to call it. But I agree.
Well, I'll tell you what I'm sure of, that the book they try to ban usually goes to the top of the bestseller list, and I very much doubt whether Alex Jones will, in the end, be silenced. There are enough well-funded
people's platforms.
Yeah, well, I think that's probably how it will work. Thanks, though, Frank. It is a testing one because, of course, if they ban the likes of Jones and Robinson, who gets banned next? These are important philosophical difficulties, and it's good that you raised them. Thanks a lot, Frank in Dumbarton. Coming up to the end of the second hour, and in the third hour, we've got the legendary Ron Paul on air. Tell everyone, even those who are not yet listening, they better tune in for the last hour. Mark in Lowestoft says, George, good to hear you've got Dr. Ron Paul on later. Perhaps that's what I should call him. At least we should get some much-needed balance to the Trump debate for a change. Instead of hearing from that snake oil salesman, John Le Boutillier, who's so far got absolutely nothing right when it comes to Trump. He'll be gone before Christmas. He'll be gone after Christmas. He'll crash the economy. He'll be indicted when FBI Director Comey testifies. Robert Mueller is closing in, even though it's been well over a year and still not a shred of hard evidence. Ask Dr. Paul about the FISA memo, FISA, which shows Russia-Trump investigation is based on a complete and utter fabrication. Love the show. All the best, George. Mark in Lowestoft. Thanks for that. And Owen in Mirfield writes back, do you think JC's brand of political rope-a-dope will be effective, George? I don't know, Owen. The proof of the pudding will be in the eating. It's just not my tradition. Rope-a-dope. I usually fight back. Tom Jarvis says, evening, G. New name for the Blairite Party. The Entitlement Party in democracy. Tepid. Not my own work, but it made me chuckle. Makes me chuckle too, Tom. A very, very interesting idea. Give me your suggestions for the new Blairite Party, will you? On Twitter, at George Galloway, at Talk Radio, or through the website and the email and the text number, which I remind you is 87222. But the phone number's the most important thing, especially in the final hour, because I really do like to hear from you about the subjects we've been discussing in the final hour. So a reminder of the number, it's 0344 499 1000. Our special guest after the break is Dr. Ron Paul. He was a congressman from Texas, and he ran to be the Republican nominee for President of the United States. That's when I first came to know of him. He's an extraordinary character. He's not on the left. Nobody should imagine that for one moment. He would describe himself, I think, as a libertarian. He wants a very, very, very small state. But he wants America to stay out of other people's affairs. In that sense, he was a precursor of Trump's America First philosophy, which he hasn't kept to, but which helped fuel him to victory in the presidential election over Hillary Clinton. Ron Paul was the first man for many decades, probably since Huey Long, to enunciate a kind of populism, an America First populism, against foreign entanglements, against foreign wars, against trade pacts like the NAFTA, which he believes, and undoubtedly correctly, has led to an exodus of homegrown American manufacturing to foreign climes where that manufacturing can be done very much more cheaply. He's a man who's against war with Russia, against war with Iran. It'll be interesting, won't it? And it's coming up after this. Now, Dr. Ron Paul, as I said, former congressman for Texas, former Republican presidential hopeful, father of Senator Rand Paul, and the principal of the Ron Paul Institute. A very, very interesting family indeed. Two politicians who've stood against the grain on international affairs as well as internal American domestic affairs. It's a privilege to be able to welcome Ron Paul onto the show. Dr. Paul, thanks for joining us.
Well, it's real nice to be on your show. I'm delighted.
Thank you, sir. Now, the proximate reason for our discussion is that at midnight, your time, a new raft of economic sanctions are being imposed, you could say reimposed, by the U.S. administration in defiance of international opinion, in defiance of treaty obligations, in defiance of the United States' closest friends like Britain and Germany and France, the EU, and for no real purpose, it seems to me, beyond the fact that the Iran nuclear deal has Barack Obama's signature on it. What do you say?
Well, in addition, it defies common sense, this whole mess that we have. You know, I'm not much of a fan for sanctions or international bodies that seem to be just into mischief. But if you have something moving in the direction that I like that, the nuclear arrangement we had with Iran, I thought that was the good thing to go. I was very disappointed, of course, when our president said, well, I'm getting out of here. And this has led just one thing to another, and he wants to go backwards to more sanctions. So it's really what we're dealing with is the principle of sanctions, which I had to put up with a lot in Congress, because I had some anti-war progressives that we worked together, but sanctions were always okay. Yeah, I won't vote for the guns and the bombs, but we vote for sanctions. But I never thought that was practical. I thought it led to trouble, and that if people did it to us, we'd consider it an act of war. So I think that's what's been going on here. Trump got it in his bee in his bonnet that he wasn't going to have this treaty. He said it during the campaign. It rarely is consistent, but he certainly was consistent on this. And of course, there's ramifications for this. So I sort of look toward what's happening in Europe and whether people are going to stand up and just roll over and do what we tell them to do and don't deal with the Iranians, or are they going to deal with Iran and maybe buy their oil and gas or whatever is necessary?
Well, it is a common misconception, and as you say, particularly on the left, that economic sanctions are somehow an alternative to war. Economic sanctions, embargo, siege, which is what we're really talking about here, these are acts of war, not alternatives to war. I've buried a lot of children, you know, in Iraq who were killed by siege.
Yeah. You know, when two countries go to war, if they haven't already invoked sanctions, what do? They try to blockade each other. You know, well, we have to deny you benefits. But if you do that first, it's still an act of war. You're participating in it. And I think, and you spoke out so clearly for so many years when those sanctions were put on, for 10 years. Matter of fact, it was used as one of the excuses for bin Laden's attack. He says, this is constant bombing and the killing that went on in Iraq. I mean, and yet nobody was saying very much back then, So that whole mess started in 1990, with the Persian Gulf War, and it's on. And the number of people that died from it, and you've made the point very clearly in your speeches about how many children died. The left sometimes will say we care about the children, but then they are equally as excited as the far right in dropping these bombs and intimidating. And this is why I often come to the conclusion that for us, Republicans and Democrats, conservatives and liberals, aren't a whole lot different other than arguing who gets to pull the strings, because they talk the same, but they basically endorse these policies. I mean, where's the resistance from the left or the Democrats? And where is any resistance? We have a few, and we always have a few speaking out, but the big stuff generally endorsed, by both elements, and then they fight and fume and pretend there's a big contest going over righteousness and evil.
Well, quite so, and let me give you a prime example. Madeleine Albright is now championing the cause of children being separated from their parents on the Mexican border. But when Leslie Stahl on ABC asked her if the killing of hundreds of thousands, at that time 570,000 children in Iraq by sanctions, if this was not a very high price to pay, and she answered, it's hard, but we think the price is worth it. So she was ready to separate Iraqi children from their families forever for political purposes, but she balks at Donald Trump for immigration purposes, separating children from their families temporarily.
Yeah, that is exactly right. And how often do you think that quote from Madeleine Albright was spread around the Middle East and in Arab Muslim nations to build up the animosity? But the main problem is, I don't know whether you have it in your country, but over here the people never paying attention, never realize the inconsistencies. The few of us who speak out aren't necessarily going to be on the evening news.
No, we're not. But that doesn't stop us, and it's never stopped you. I said in my introduction before you came on that you were, in fact, the trailblazer of, certainly for many decades, you were the first to argue from a position. You're a conservative. You're on the right of politics, not the left. But you wanted to attend to America first. You wanted to deal with America's problems and stop interfering in other people's affairs. Did you see when Trump emerged a man that might just actually carry your message, as you unfortunately were not able to do, all the way into the White House?
Well, I don't know what will happen, but you know, the whole thing is, if you look toward a principle that you deal with your own country, people sometimes interpret that means, oh, you're an isolationist, you don't care about other people, and you're not going to help, and they paint you into the corner. But you know, if a country looks to themselves and works on the problems we all have, every country has problems, then because to me it's a moral issue, we don't have the moral right to go about telling other people how to live on an individual basis or an international basis. So if we set standards, there was a time when America, you know, was seen for setting standards, but not in the last 75 years or so. It's just been very destructive, and I think though, if under the case of you know, a reasonable trade agreement and getting along with people and traveling and sharing ideas, it's, to me, from a libertarian viewpoint, it's not isolationism. It's trying to set a standard and try to persuade people. It's a voluntary society. All these things that the left pretends that they believe in and has to force down our throat. Well, the goal may be decent, but the use of force is what I detest. So it might be good that you could say, well, country A, B, and C need to improve themselves. Maybe so. Why don't we set a good example? Why don't we try to understand economics better? And that's the way I work, rather than saying that I know best and therefore you will do it. If you don't do it, I'm going to punish you. And I just don't like that approach because I don't think it works. I don't think, even if both sides were sincere, the side that uses force and innuendos and bombs, it doesn't work. And we should be more practical in saying, well, we want to help people, so we don't need to push everything down their throat.
Well, the other track in recent times has produced yet another contradiction. The Democrats and the anti-war movement and the left and so on are pretty comprehensively against a posture of hostility towards Iran. They're against the breaking of the nuclear deal and so on. Yet when Trump appears to have solved the danger of imminent war with North Korea, the same people that are for jaw on Iran are for war on Korea. How does that work?
Well, all I can say is it doesn't make any sense. It's inconsistent. You wonder, what's his strategy? Does he have a strategy? And right now, if he does, I don't understand it. We who come from a libertarian position, we have a basic principle that we endorse, and you can interpret almost everything we do from the fact that we don't believe that the use of force is a good thing to try to tell other people how to live. But when somebody does it one day and says one thing that will bomb you to smithereens, then the next day they're the best friends and we want to come and talk to you. The one thing, though, about Iran is unfortunately, our president's been a little bit more consistent. At least there's a little bit of hope with Korea. He backs off a little bit. But when it comes to Iran, no, it is absolutely, you cannot see, and they are the worst evil empire ever, and they'll throw things out that they're the most radical Islamic state ever in the history of mankind, and that's why we have to help Saudi Arabia, because they have such high ideals.
But Saudi Arabia is, of course, the fountainhead of the Islamist extremist, ISIS, Al-Qaeda mentality, which has cascaded around the whole world. Saudi Arabia is provably the fountainhead, financial, ideological, theological fountainhead. It's not Iran that flew airplanes into the Twin Towers. It was 13 out of 19 Saudi hijackers who did so. And yet Trump is now in bed with Saudi Arabia and the smaller satrapies around it. And he's doing this to please Saudi Arabia, who may or may not have stuffed America's pockets with gold. I'd count it if I were you, because they don't always honor their financial agreements. But there's only Israel and Saudi Arabia and the smaller Gulf sheikhdoms that are actually in favor of this policy. And yet it seems to have taken root and is now the stated policy of the United States.
Yeah, I think there's always been some of that, but I think it's very, very much out in the open with this administration, very blatant. And I think that may be a bad sign that they feel so confident. In other words, maybe, they think that they can get away with it. So it's very, very discouraging that they can gang up on a country like that. I mean, where do we hear the truth of anything? It is so chaotic now, and I think that our policies are, very backward looking. We're looking how are we going to maintain our empire? Nobody's saying how are we going to protect your liberties? How are we going to make sure that you're free people and live your own lives? It's how are you going to maintain the empire and your power and the oil and the banking system and the reserve currency. All these things, this is on their minds, and that's what they're arguing for. And sometimes a lot of those things are bipartisan. They sort of argue the case for the empire, and I think that the notion of the empire is a very dangerous notion.
Indeed, I can say that with certainty from London, which was once the heart of a pretty big empire. Now, what the listeners don't know, but Senator John McCain knows, is that you and I are secretly comrades. We're both working for Vladimir Putin. How did you respond to McCain's absurd charge the other day?
Well, I didn't pay any attention to them. I think sometimes giving them attention means I think it's serious, and so I didn't go out of my way, and nobody came and asked me for an answer. I think he's lost a lot of credibility, and I don't want to give him any credibility by needing to answer back to him. The other day I thought I sort of got a chuckle out of when there was an attempt to kill Maduro in Venezuela and with a drone. And immediately Bolton, in our administration said, we didn't do it. And I got to thinking, well, what other country has to immediately deny they didn't try to kill somebody and assassinate somebody? So it's to me a bad situation. But basically, it's an attitude about foreign policy. I call it interventionism. We ought to mind our own business. We ought to be designed for, trading and talking with people and getting along, even though it will be done imperfectly. But when you look at what we have today, it's so imperfect when you look back after, over the years on how we have, even really since World War I, how the West and the United States has gotten so much involved in the entire Middle East. And now it's been translated into this migration problem, which Europe is, of course, suffering a lot more than the United States. And that's a consequence of much of our mischief,
Exactly.
causing people to want to leave. I mean, how can you not be sympathetic with people whose houses have been bombed away and try to escape, and then also the people with all other ulterior motives join in, and they are able to, capture some benefits from that.
Well, it takes a unique moral standpoint to bomb countries, create wars in countries, and then slam the door on the refugees that are fleeing from those conflicts. Finally, Dr. Paul, and I'm grateful for your time, will Russia do in President Trump? Will they break the presidency of Donald Trump over this Russiagate affair?
I would say no, but I don't think I'd bet all my life on it. The one reason is I think Trump is tough on this issue, and I think 99% of what we've heard are probably lies, and that maybe the people will wake up, but who knows what will happen? There's been things happen that I never predicted would, but if the question being, do I think they will, this whole affair, do Trump down, and get impeached? I would say no, but I guess we have to wait to see how it evolves. And
ancillary, if you'll permit me to that, he's standing around 40% in the polls. Do you think the Republican Party are going to survive the midterm elections? And is he going to, if he does stay out of the clutches of these various inquiries, is he going to be re-elected for a second term, do you think?
I think under today's circumstances, I think it's a reasonable thing to believe that he would. Matter of fact, a poll just recently that has been quoted that he has popped up to about 50%, where he was higher than Obama was at this time, in his first term. So the hatred and vitriol is much greater than it's ever been before, and who knows which way that will go, and who can tell the biggest lies, and who's going to be talked into believing those lies. That's probably going to be what happens. But I think that I imagine the Republicans are going to lose some things, some districts, and be weaker in the next Congress. But I don't think they're going to. I don't think the Democrats are going to take over the Congress. And the media paints it as, the Democrats are on the verge of taking it over. Where were they when they were predicting about Trump versus Hillary? They didn't do so well on those predictions.
No.
They just hope that the media shouting this stuff will convince everybody,
yes.
We might as well stay at home because it's a slam dunk for us.
We have exactly. I was the only person that I know who predicted Trump's victory and predicted the victory of Brexit in the EU referendum. And too many people in the media and in the political class think the mere assertion, concerted assertion of things by them makes them facts. And of course, every now and again, the people come along and teach them differently. Now, the Ron Paul Institute, how do people follow you, Doctor? How do people support your work?
Well, what I do is I do a program each day, the Ron Paul LibertyReport.com, and I stream at 11 o'clock Central Time, and I put a program up each day, and we put a lot of other things up, but it's the Ron Paul Liberty Report that I'm putting most of my energy in, and that's associated with the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity, and that's a foreign policy think tank.
Well, it's been an honor to talk with you. Thank you very much for joining us, Dr. Ron Paul, joining us from the United States. What do you think about what he had to say? It seems to me he'd have made quite a good president. Well, that was Dr. Ron Paul, a man of the right, a libertarian, a man with very different politics to me, but who on foreign policy would undoubtedly have been an improvement on George W. Bush, Barack Obama, and Donald Trump. That's my take. What's yours? 0344 499 1000. David has rung from Brighton. That's why he's up next. Go ahead, David.
Well, it's great to listen to you talking to Ron, George, because you're both heroes of mine.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Because of the stance you take on foreign policy. I became aware of Ron in 2012 because I had to take a very sudden break from work to become a carer, and I suddenly had lots of time at home, and I was watching the presidential debates on YouTube, the recordings of them, and I heard Ron talking about foreign policy and taking on the likes of Romney and Giuliani and anybody else he was around.
Yes, yes. I mean, he was a hot potato, wasn't he? I mean, of course, the bigger funded campaigns certainly saw him off in the end, but there was a moment when he was a real contender.
He did really well in the colleges. I mean, the young people in particular, he was having big meetings around the colleges. The sad thing is, George, is people like yourselves, I mean, you've had the similar experience in British politics where you were unfairly thrown at the Labour Party and you sort of, haven't really had a very easy, you haven't been treated right, in my opinion. And I can sort of go along with that myself because I was a union official and I was basically... I had to get out because I was fighting the people in power too much. And it's a bit of a sad thing in politics that, good, honest, principled people are often on the fringes.
Well, it's kind of you to say. I mean, I do feel a burning sense of injustice about my expulsion from the Labour Party, especially the way things then turned out in the war and the occupation and so on. But nobody needs to feel sorry for me because, I'm doing fine. But the sense that one is absolved by history, that vindicated by history, is even faster now than it's ever been before. I mean, on all the big issues on which I've made a stand, I feel entirely vindicated already, and I'm far from dead yet, I hope. And Ron Paul must feel the same. I mean, he opposed the Iraq War, and look how that turned out. You oppose these things, you warn people of how badly they're going to go wrong and how wrong they are. And, before you could say Jack Robinson nowadays, it's kind of obvious that you were right.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. I just want to see one of our kind get into power. I want to see a president or in America or a prime minister, in Britain, a man of integrity and honesty who sticks to his guns.
It would be a fine thing. It would be a fine thing, Dave. Listen, thank you very much for your very kind words and your excellent call. Let me go to Casif in Leeds. Go ahead, Casif, it's your turn.
Hello, George. Just 2 points. Firstly, about people like Alex Jones. I mean, you cannot block them, you can't censor them, because then they'll have a point. I mean, a lot of Christians in America, and of course, Christians believe that during the end times, people will be liars. So they say, they're blocking us, they're censoring us because we're telling the truth. So if you give them oxygen by blocking them, the fire is going to get bigger. But if you let them stay on their course, no one with two brain cells will pay any attention to them.
Well, of course, I understand that argument. But what if somebody is using, say you and I were the owners of a social media platform, and somebody was using our social media platform to evince hatred of a religious or racial character against a group of people, say Muslims, say people from Leeds. Are we under an obligation to continue to allow that person to use our platform, Casif?
Well, certain videos that do have that content will be removed, but you can't put a blanket ban on the entire content, because then they just make a website and they'll say, come to a website and don't use YouTube because they've censored us, or don't use this social media platform because they censored us. It's as simple as that. Then more people will know about it around the world, because they'll think, they must be telling the truth, because the establishment is trying to hush them up. So they'll get more exposure. But right now, they haven't got much exposure. But once you try to censor somebody, that person gets more exposure all of a sudden.
That's true. I recognise that point. What was your second point you wanted to make?
George, I think you and the Lexiteers need to come have a meeting, just like the Blairites having now, and form a new political party with common sense. I mean, you can get voters from the left and the right with certain policies such as pro-Brexit policies, raising corporation tax to bring it back to Germany's level and other common sense policies. You win by a landslide.
Cassif, I've been there, done that, got the T-shirt, could show you my scars. You know, I've run out of money because of the attempts to form independent political parties, make films independently, and so on. That's why I'm working every night, because I've got, by the grace of God, 5 children and a lot of mouths to feed. But thanks for your kind words and thoughts. That was Cassif in Leeds. Where do you stand? 0344 499 1000. That's the number to call, and lots of people are writing in. Here is X-Ray Vision. I've been amazed at how the British MSM haven't been reporting on the drone assassination attempt on Maduro's life, especially after all the slagging off and humiliating of Venezuela that they do. It's almost as if it never happened. Well, worse than that, X-Ray Vision. The Guardian, no less, perhaps especially The Guardian, they immediately suggested that it was a gas explosion. They immediately suggested, in fact, their entire report was that Maduro will repress the people in Venezuela after the opposition tried to kill him with a drone in a military parade. Imagine, God forbid, somebody tried to assassinate Her Majesty on a state occasion. Would the headline in The Guardian be, Theresa May will now repress the people of Britain? Or would it have been outrage at the attempt to murder our head of state? I tell you, The Guardian makes me sick. X-Ray Vision goes on. America's having a hard time facing up to the fact that the days of their empire are numbered, but they're going down fighting. Never an easy thing, giving up an empire. Don't we know it? And Chris says, how can Trump desire war with Iran while desiring peace with Russia, since Iran and Russia are allies? How can he square this circle? I've no idea. I don't have a psychology degree. Here's Gordon in Largs. Maybe he does. Go ahead, Gordon.
Hello, George.
Hi, sir.
A pleasure to meet you.
Largs is a beautiful place. I love it very much. The Celtic used to train.
You.
The Celtic used to train there. I went to a conference there about 40 years ago. I still recall it. Anyway, Gordon, sorry. Tell me.
I remember when you were Hillhead in the early 80s.
Yeah.
You were the Hillhead MP.
Yeah. I was there. I was nearly 20 years there. These were good days. I was in Glasgow. I was in Glasgow earlier, a few days ago, actually, and I was in my old constituency. And, well, you know, Tony Blair committed a lot of worse crimes, but kicking me out of that constituency, which I loved so much, is something I'll never forgive him for. I'll tell you.
And I won't forgive him.
Thank you, Gordon. Thank you. Now, what would you like to say?
What was put up about, George, was Jeremy. I like Jeremy Corbyn a lot, but the thing is, I don't think he's got the. He's not got the toughness that's required.
Well, he's not a man of steel. That's true, no, Gordon. But I'll tell you what he is. He's totally stoic. If you think about it, he's put up with 3 years of this day and night, and he hasn't flinched. Of course, he can't do and say everything he'd like to because he's between the rock of the Parliamentary Labour Party and the hard place of virtually no majority on the National Executive Committee. So sometimes he's had to retreat, but he's never flinched. You know, they haven't broken him. They tried to break him, Gordon, but they haven't succeeded in doing that.
And that's good. That's good because I'm a great supporter of him. And
how do you think it's playing in Scotland, Gordon? I mean, if I were a young person of progressive views in Scotland, you know, I could be tempted by the SNP, but I'd want to give Jeremy Corbyn maybe one last chance, wouldn't you?
Exactly. That's what's going on in Scotland at the moment. I think they're waiting to see if Jeremy actually gets in.
Yeah, because, I mean, it makes sense. If you could have a Jeremy Corbyn Labour government, why would you want to break the country up?
Exactly, George. And people realise this. They know the importance of Corbyn and the importance that he's got to be the next Prime Minister.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly how I would look at it. What about the other borough, who's the Scottish Labour leader now? How's he doing? Richard Leonard. He's not exactly set the heather on fire, is he?
No, they're not convinced by him at the moment, George. And I think that's got a lot to do with. I don't think there should be a Scottish Labour Party, George. I think there should just be a Labour Party. You know,
that's an interesting point. If it was Corbyn that was speaking for Labour in Scotland as elsewhere, that's an interesting point. Let's see what other people think. I think
they should just forget about the Scottish Labour and just make it their Labour Party. And if you want to vote for it, they're up for grabs in Scotland as well. Because at the end of the day, we're still part of the United Kingdom.
And what about the wee Ian? She was on the stage today with Theresa May, sharing a platform with Theresa May. How did that go? I haven't seen the news.
Well, they were talking about Brexit. Apparently, they never agreed. What a surprise that was, George.
There you go. I better catch up with that. So there they were, Theresa May and Nicola Sturgeon. That's a duo for you. The Crankies, right enough. Gordon, many thanks. It's been a pleasure talking to you and remembering the lovely Largs. Let's hear from the legend, Norma in Bristol. Go ahead, Norma.
Hello, George.
Hi.
When Professor Ron Paul was not liking the use of force, I thought this is relevant to bring up, really, because yesterday, 73 years ago, the atom bomb Little Boy was dropped by the USA on Nagasaki and then Hiroshima, and they killed and they maimed and they buried hundreds of thousands, and never again, George. The thing is, do you think it would be possible? I know it's the name that nobody dare speak of, Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament.
CND, yes, they're still going.
Yeah, I know they are. I'm a member. But you see, we'd never like to mention the name, because poor old Corbyn, if they ever brought that up, well...
Well, he was the president, wasn't he?
I know he was, but nobody likes to talk about it. And they think that, Corbyn and we don't want the proliferation of nuclear weapons.
Well, as a matter of fact, we're committed by treaty to work towards the elimination of nuclear weapons. It's just that it never happens.
We don't sign the thing properly either. But you think it would be all right to get a representative from CND because of this specific week, just to interview and give a little bit of something to this side of not having nuclear weapons?
Well, my clever colleagues behind the glass, and a clever group they are, I must say. They landed Ron Paul for the show. I hope they get the gold medallion. Player of the month, I think, Ryan deserves for that. And they've heard you. Let's see if we can get someone on from CND, because you're right, Norma. It's a very, very auspicious week. Okay, you've only got about 15 minutes left to call me, 0344 499 1000. Okay, I'm getting so much traffic on the Twitter and so on that I can't actually get to it. So if my clever colleagues can give me more up on my screen that I haven't read yet, I'd appreciate it. I think it's logjam. Meanwhile, let's take a call from a now regular caller in Massachusetts in the United States. My goodness, we're being listened to everywhere. It's Dennis. Dennis, welcome back.
Thank you, my good man.
We can't go on talking like this every night, but go ahead anyway.
I know it's like we have an affair of some sort, but we won't go there.
No.
First, we'll talk about Alex Jones, and then I'll tell you a funny story about I wouldn't start from here.
Okay.
So here's the problem. things like YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, not just companies. They are the new public square. If you ban someone from these, you are banning them from the public square. I'm uncomfortable with that.
Okay.
That's my take on it.
Yeah, but these are private businesses, Dennis. They're not obliged They're not obliged to provide a platform for any crank to spew out hate, are they?
Well, it used to be every year the Nazis would have a march. I forgot where in the U.S. And every year the American Civil Liberties Union had to have a lawsuit so they could freely march. Not a Nazi, don't like Nazis, never did. But I recognize that they have a right to the public square.
You see, I just don't agree. That's the difference between you and me, Dennis. You're a liberal. Mm-hmm. You're a liberal, and I'm not. You see.
Oh no, you've insulted me.
Have I? Well, I mean, I think that's quintessential liberalism. I don't think that Nazis have got the right to march. I really don't. Nazis should be in jail.
Let me tell you what Justice Brandeis did, which of course was not a justice in England, but he said, I have heard that sunlight is the best disinfectant. That's kind of how I feel about it. But anyway, we can agree to disagree.
I agree. These are important philosophical questions. No one has the right or wrong answer to them. And of course, whatever stance you take is pregnant with difficulties. My problem is I can't bring myself to watch what it was that Alex Jones was saying that got him banned, because I saw his Sandy Hook performances.
Yeah.
And they shocked me to the core.
I don't want to be in a position where I have to defend.
No, I know that.
Alex Jones.
I know that. Tell me a funny story. The hour is late.
So if this is in relationship to, I wouldn't have started from here.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite sayings.
So in New England, a gentleman is lost in the nether regions of New England, and he stops at a farmhouse, and he says, how can I get to the next local city? And the farmer says, well, you could go down that road, but it's the wrong direction. You could have gone down that road, but the bridge is out. This road here, they haven't completed construction, so can't get there from here.
That's amazing.
You just can't get there from here. That's the whole thing.
Yeah, very. I mean, of course, there are places that we can't get to, but we would have to abandon our car and walk along the road that's not yet completed. Although there was a great slogan in, I think it's in Cuba, I saw painted on a wall. It said this, Dennis: Walker, there is no path. The path is made by walking. How's that?
Oh, I like it.
How's that? Very good. Dennis, a pleasure. I love your voice. Thank you very much indeed. Lizzie says, I totally agree with Gordon and Largs. The Labour Party needs Jeremy Corbyn in Scotland too. And Ditto, a very clever duo, I think. Certainly a small group. Democracy is their avatar. Very, very clever people. Says, I see where your caller in Largs is coming from, but Labour needs a leader in Holyrood, and no sitting MSP is better suited to the job than trade unionist and economics expert Richard Leonard. He just needs to be his own man and set out his own plan. Well, I agree with that for sure. Of the members sitting in Holyrood, there isn't a better one than Richard Leonard. I entirely concur with that. But I have to say, I was in Scotland for several days. I spoke to a lot of Labour people, and without exception, I think I can say, all of them expressed their disappointment at how things have gone under Richard's leadership. So he's going to have to up his game, would be how I think I would put it. Wayne Mack says, top quote of the night, and inevitably, was Mr. George Galloway. Quote, he's not exactly setting the heather on fire, re the Scottish Labour Party leader, whose name's so unforgettable. I forgot. It's Richard Leonard. He's a good man. Here is my old friend Marie McFarlane. Richard Leonard is not getting any coverage as First Minister and the opposition. Davidson is best reported. He has lived, worked and campaigned for socialism in Scotland for 35 years. We have a majority pro-Corbyn Leonard Scottish Executive Committee. And Labour's campaign for socialism in Scotland fights Tories and nationalists. All of that, of course, accepted. And John Hughes says, I remember during the time of the US elections when Ron Paul was running, the US media establishment ridiculed him to discredit him. I remember thinking to myself about how unseemly and graceless it looked. Now, from the standpoint of someone on the left in Britain, it's difficult to love a libertarian in the United States. It's difficult to agree that there should be little or no welfare system. It's difficult to agree that everything should be private and the state should be as small as is humanly possible. It goes against the grain for those of us on the left. But I'll tell you this. I'd rather have a libertarian with the integrity of Dr. Ron Paul than a liberal with the integrity of Hillary Clinton or Barack Obama. Because, in the end, what happens in America is America's business. I just want them to stay out of our business, out of the business of the rest of the world. I want to see a leadership in America that attends to the broken bridges and the roads not completed and the rusting hulks of former manufacturing greatness. I want to see a leadership in America that attends to the fact that you send your children to school in the morning not really sure if somebody's going to fill them full of hot lead when they're sitting in the classroom. I would prefer an American leadership that attended to the murder rate in the United States, to the rate of poverty and hunger, to the low life expectancy, to the high infant mortality. I'd like to see someone in America build a great America from sea to shining sea. I just don't want to be an American, and I don't want the Americans to be interfering in the world. And if you ask me what the interview, which I hope will travel far and for long, that I did with Ron Paul this evening, we got to hear a man who really did want to put America first, who really does want to stop making war around the world against other people's countries. And I find it difficult to place a value on that. Matter of fact, I'd call it priceless. Chris in Colchester says, George, that was just brilliant with Ron Paul. I could have listened to the conversation all night. It just shows that people across the spectrum can have a mature discussion about numerous issues. Really puts a dent in the mainly constructed left and right divide. Made my night. Cheers, George. Chris in Colchester. Thank you, Chris. Kind of made my night too. David Leviscont says, dangerous to say all Nazis should be locked up. Who decides? Corbyn would be locked up for anti-Semite. Who decides? Well, you know, if it looks like a duck and walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it's probably a duck. If somebody is wearing a swastika on their armband, worshipping Hitler and Hitlerism, denying the Holocaust of 6 million Jews and many millions of others, if somebody is taking as their Bible Mein Kampf, I don't think they've got any rights. Because if they came to power, they'd make another Holocaust. And they sure would trample down your public square, David. I don't know if you have any weaknesses that Nazis would pick upon. Your sexual orientation, maybe, your ethnicity, your race, your religion, your politics. Because that's what the Nazis did and would have kept on doing if we, for 1 year, had not stood alone against them, if the Red Army had not defeated them at Stalingrad, at Kursk, and all the way to Berlin. If the United States had not joined us, far too late, but nonetheless vitally, invading Europe in 1945 to begin the liberation of France and the Low Countries. If we had not stood against Nazism, I would be speaking to you this evening in German, except I wouldn't be speaking to you at all, because I'd be dead, and so, David, quite likely, would be you. So, I'm no champion of unlimited free speech for just anybody, but I'm grateful for the free speech I've had with you this evening. And if you were, you can come back again tomorrow night for yet another edition of the mother of all talk shows, only on Talk Radio. The great Ian Lee up next, surreally brilliant as always. Stay tuned to Talk Radio.